name's Anthony. I'm from Gamers Command. I wanted to do a quick overview of my third place finishing mono win deck from the Chicago Materia Cup. I think that this deck was really, really cool to bring, mainly because it was completely a lone, mono win deck in the room. Not a single other person was on it. And I'm by no means inherently in and of itself like a good deck builder. Like in an isolated vacuum, I work with a bunch of my friends and teammates to try to really hone in the optimal route for the deck. But I think that what's kind of cool is that it does show that there is still room for innovation in the current meta. I think that Mono Wind has always been a very scary deck to bring to larger tournaments, for myself at least, because the way I view it is I feel like I'm taking three things into consideration. One, that I'm not going to run into aggro. Two, that I'm going to be lucky enough to draw what I need to draw. And three, that I'm competent enough to actually pilot it in the first place. And the way that I started to try to think about it was, is there a way that I can construct this deck that I'm not so overwhelmingly scared of any deck in particular? Really, in a mid-rangey kind of game or in a longer game, I should have a winning scenario most of the time. The real question just comes down to, can I survive Swiss? Can I survive aggro if necessary? So I want to start off by talking about the backups first, which is I think a kind of like a weird starting point for a lot of deck talks. However, I think that the backup line in this is really the most interesting part of the deck, and probably where the most innovation actually happened. So traditionally, the backup engine for Mono Wind has been 3 copies of Norshdalen, 3 copies of Chocobo Sam, a fat Chocobo from Opus 4, I believe, and then you search either Chocolate or a random garbage Chocobo backup that you have just for the purpose of not bricking on fat Chocobo. And then maybe like a Carpenter or two. And that's fine. You know, you're going to ramp like a lunatic on that. However, it is, at the end of the day, in that circumstance, a Opus 19 deck. You don't really add anything to it. As far as straight storming from your 50 main cards in your deck, I don't think that anyone can deny that Alex Hancock probably perfected that in his Worlds list. You can storm like a lunatic in that deck, even if you're not that experienced of a player. Now, the way I viewed it was, and something that a lot of people have pointed out, is that, Mono Wind doesn't have really particularly good limit breaks. I think that Ace is actually wildly underrated, but at the end of the day, I can't deny, Yuri's garbage, doesn't do anything. Whereas Leo is probably the best Storm card ever printed since Storm became a relevant thing with the printing of Luso. So for that reason, I decided to do the Pinello Philo route, which I don't really think is by any means something that is like, oh, only I saw. I think a lot of people saw this. And if you look at lists from other countries where a few mono win lists did creep in, you would see people running like 2 copies of Philo just in the deck without running the rest of the backup engines, and they would just hope to run into it. What I like was the fact that Pinello actually exists and can search her. So I can actually do a search engine for the Philo or the kites, and that's kind of what got me really interested in this particular build. What I'll say is the one bad thing about Pinello that Norshdalen doesn't have is that Pinello is not actually a Sky Pirate herself. So she's not like Norshdalen, where Norshdalen can search herself, or like Buddy, where Buddy can search himself in a backup engine storm. So you need to have a few more targets, I feel, than Norshdalen does to make sure that she's always live. I would say I don't think necessarily you need more than 3 targets. So I do think that Fran could be cut, as Fran is obviously just a Sky Pirate for the purposes of searching out off of Pinello. Though in the current meta, playing a Fran, pop in a Leo, which basically every single deck is running, it's not the worst thing that you could possibly do with a turn. And there were certain circumstances where I would jump into something like I think I attacked at one point with like a Zidane, and then I played a Fran so that I could kill Garnet or something like that. But that's like hyper specific. Now, I think the Sky Pirates as a whole are really, really powerful. Kites, I think, is wildly underutilized. I think that the fact that he can produce water is just a bonus with Philo on the field, but at the same time, anybody who really has piloted Wind knows how often you are exactly 1 CP shy of doing something, and he does represent a 2 CP contingent backup. And the fact that he can activate 2 characters rather than just produce 2 CP is actually really good, because then that means that you can, if you draw an Asura, you can play Asura, get the Luso back, and then cast Luso. So you can get 2 extra casts just off of Kites breaking himself. And the availability of backups breaking is extremely nice for Win, so that theoretically your backups in later game aren't immediately considered dead draws. You do have the potential to break something and then replay it just to continue upping your cast count. And for that reason, I also do think Fran was acceptable. I didn't think that I felt really bad playing her. What I'll say then for the Nordstalin line, 3 copies of Nordstalin, I think that's pretty standard. You really need to see your backups in Wind, obviously. Otherwise, you're going to be completely uphill and be completely screwed. Stiltskin, I think, is in every single Wind deck, basically. I think that the incorporation of the Yuffie build, which we'll go into in a little bit, is actually makes Stiltskin even better, because now I have a Stiltskin's target that I'm happy to throw in the break zone should I need extra 2 more CP for something, because you never really want to throw the Luso or the Evray away, even though you can Asura them back. You don't want to put yourself at risk of both an Amat ending your storm as well as a Mist Dragon ending your storm. So I do like being able to just throw Yuffie away off the Stiltskin. And then Nash, I think, is probably the most wildly underutilized backup. In Mono Wind, I think that this card is so good that I would even consider a universe where I would try to put him in Wind builds if I'm having any splashing of Wind. Nash came in wildly beneficial throughout the weekend. Certain decks that I was wanting to prepare for were Chaos Arc and Refia Control, and the Nash almost always has a target for his ETB. In the Mike Powell list, for example, they really only can produce Fire CP via the 3 copies of Lunith, Tyro, or Shantoto. And they're not really going to cast a Shantoto most of the time just for the purpose of color fixing. So really, you have to concern yourself with Lunith and Tyro. And they only have 6 copies of those cards. And Nash can break on entry the Tyro, and then an action ability can break the Lunith. And what's wildly insane about Nash is he's loopable off of Asura. So there was at least one game I know in day 2, which I ironically ended up losing because I kind of got a little bit ahead of myself and played really poorly. I at one point got my opponent, who's on Shark, down to 1 backup because he had a Yuna, a Tyro, and a Thornton, if I recall correctly. And then I Nash action ability broke the Yuna. And then my favorite line in this deck is you can cast Lulu, get back Asura, cast Asura, get back Nash, replay Nash for cast 3, and now you also broke the Tyro. That's extraordinarily debilitating, especially against like Chaos Arc, because it's going to cost them 9 to actually Chaos Arc. So that's effectively pitching their entire hand, assuming they even started off with 6 cards in hand, and one of them is Chaos and one of them is Arc. And so that play in and of itself is reason enough, in my opinion, to have Nash in the deck. And then I needed 2 more backups, and before I was on Yuffie, these 2 backups were actually Vieira, because Vieira was nice because it was another thing that would activate Kites. He activates when you reveal a Category 12 character and add to hand. So, but then I started to think, how do I actually deal with aggro? And Mena is obviously a kicking off point towards talking about Yuffie. So Yuffie is a weird card because she is extremely opposite of what Storm is trying to accomplish. However, she is extremely good in a lot of circumstances of soloing aggro. There are answers for her. She is by no stretch of the imagination infallible. However, she's really, really, really good at stalling and putting yourself in a position that they can't kill you while you're continuing to build. And she's not so expensive that you can't at least just keep her there. You can't cast her and then you're like, I'm so far behind, it's going to take me 3 turns to catch back up. So the obvious elephant in the room going into Chicago was, I'm going to run into some degree of Knights. How many Knights? I have no idea. But I will see a Knights player at some point or another. So how do I deal with that? Do I just accept a game loss? And my mentality with these decks, and whenever I build decks, is I don't want to build any deck that I'm just like, yeah, I have a 0 to 100 matchup. Like, I'm going to lose every single time. I think that's like not a winning mentality, and I don't like the idea of being like, I am going to rely on luck of bracket to do well in this tournament. I ironically did do pretty well, in part because of luck of bracket on day 2. However, that's beyond the point. So I needed to prepare for Knights somehow, and Yuffie was the answer I came up with. Now, like I said earlier, she is by no means infallible. There are 2 answers for Yuffie in most versions of Knights, 3 if you consider Cuchulainn, if they are running that. The Yuffie will die to a Ramza trigger, and she will also die to an Amaterasu and then like a chump block from like one of the garbage Knights, like Lilith or Physalis or something. And also on top of that, for what it's worth, if they have Beatrix out, they can make all of their things enormous, and then it's pretty difficult to block over. However, what Yuffie does do is she does make it fairly challenging for them to actually swing over her. And in addition to that, she has the capability of killing 4 of the Knights all at once, which is pretty big, because to kill 4 forwards off of 1 special is kind of humongous. So you can kill Ramza plus Beatrix, assuming that she's not buffed. You can kill a Laswell and a Charlotte, assuming you're not at damage 3, all at once, or a Lilith or a Physalis, which is pretty crazy, actually, to do a 4 trade for a total of 4 CP. One other thing that's kind of cool with her, because we're in mono wind, there are ways to activate her, assuming that you try to swing and then the Amaterasu, her reactivation and inability of being chosen, you could Asura her back up or Kites her back up and then do the S on the stack before they can declare blocks. So that's another interesting thing that did happen very, very frequently, and something to consider. The fact that Yuffie, the small Yuffie, can be searched off of Silkskin and then later assured back is pretty humongous, because that effectively reads that you have access to a total of like 3 extra copies of Asura, 3 extra copies of Asura via Lulu, so 6 extra copies of Yuffie, plus the other 2. So you have basically the capability of Yuffie specialing 8 total times, which is kind of ridiculous. And if you can resolve Yuffie special even just twice, you basically win on the spot. Now, the other aggro deck in the meta that I was concerned with was Wool 7 on specifically the KP list, because that one's a little bit more aggressive than the Alex Hancock list. That one is probably the hardest matchup for this deck and is the only loss I actually took in Swiss on day 1. The thing is that Yuffie does do a very good job at making things pretty awkward for them because of the fact that they can't really swing over her. However, they have 2 hits that if they get either of them, it invalidates the Yuffie completely. And that's either Diana or it's Zeromus. And that's not a deck, unfortunately, where you can actually Yuffie special, because they'll obviously just protect it. You can Yuffie special and kill like the Raijin Fujin, but at the end of the day, they're not the ones that are actually going to make you lose the game. So that is one of the harder matchups. A card that's really good in win for those matchups specifically is the Goddess, which I could have included, and I did include in a different build, and that kind of completely solos that deck. They just can't deal with it and the constant break zone removal. However, I was hoping to not have them flip Zeromus or Diana, and when I played against Cody in the final round of Swiss, he hit Zeromus on 2 separate occasions, which was a little bit hurtful. Anyway, that's, I think, enough about the Yuffie conversation. Now let's talk about the classic storming. So with Storm, there is a certain amount of cards that you need to include in order to accomplish Storm. You need at least 2 Lusos. Sometimes I have historically run 3 in the past when I wasn't on Stiltskin, but ever since I went back on Nordstalin, Stiltskin, Nash line, I think that 2 is more than enough. Luso in and of itself is not really a good Storm card. He does draw you a card, but he's also so vulnerable to getting killed by things, so he's actually kind of hard to Chocobo back because he'll die to a Goblin ping from like a Realm deck. He'll die to a Wool ping. He does so much that it's kind of scary to actually try to bounce him back in the middle of a storm. I run 3 copies of Zidane. Zidane, I've realized, is in and of himself almost a separate win con and is a must-kill target for a lot of decks, for basically every deck, because he generates you a second hand. So even if he just gets the 2 cards on entry and swing, even if you go down to 1 card in hand, yes, the 2 cards that you get are probably not as storm efficient. However, they are also like a separate hand, things that you can cast. If you steal a Mist Dragon, what that basically says is you have like a 1 CP Mist Dragon in hand, because you're not actually losing a card from hand to play the Mist Dragon itself. Or if you get a Cooch Lane, you get like a 1 CP draw a card and blank something. So he ups your cast count really, really well, even if the card you get isn't like particularly useful. Against Knights, I stole like a Beatrix, and that Beatrix got me to cast 7 and got the Luso off. Ever since Luso was printed, Luso has basically dictated what the identity of Mono Wind is, which is to cast 7 cards and win the game. And he runs perfectly with regards to the Lulu, because the Lulu has to shrink down some of the bigger targets so that he actually can kill them. The Lulu, I think, I've seen historically run at 2 copies in certain lists. However, I think that 3 copies is, in my opinion, where she sits best, especially because getting back water summons is pretty important for reasons we'll go into shortly. Rosa in a long game can give you like an upward surplus of like generating over like 20 CP, and she's actually kind of just annoying in general. Sometimes you can just hardcast her against Knights. This is not a good play, but you could hardcast her against Knights, and then it just kind of means that the little Knights have a very difficult time swinging in unless they want to trade 2 for 1 with the Rosa. Like if they have like a Beatrix and a Laswell, well, neither of them could swing, or they can both swing because they can't party, and you kill 2 of them for just killing Rosa. So, and she's untargetable, so she can't get froze or anything. I wouldn't recommend that play, but it is a play that does make it a little bit awkward. Similarly, actually, for Fina, hardcasting Fina is almost never the answer. However, against Knights in testing, though it never actually came up on tournament day, she's actually pretty annoying also, because she actually can't even be chosen at all. So she can't be frozen down. So that's kind of annoying for them. Fina, however, is obviously intended to be the hand trap of choice, to be my effective like water Amaterasu, because she can't do like backup auto cancellation, so she's not as good as actual Amaterasu. However, she can be really debilitating and is basically a card at the end of the game that says, okay, you were trying to stabilize, you don't, and now you're going to lose the game. As far as monsters are concerned, Evray, Atomos, those are pretty classic. I do know a lot of decks run 1 of Atomos. I think that Atomos is extraordinarily valuable. I prefer to run him at 2 because I can't actually search him otherwise. And also one thing I forgot to mention in forwards, Shinryu. I actually don't think Shinryu is as good of a board clear in Mono Win versus the really aggressive matchups as I think some other players think he is. And the reason I say that is the reason why aggro is as good as it is in our game right now is because it's extraordinarily CP efficient, actually. So let's say they Corilla turn 1 and they get 2 not so great Knights. They get like a Steiner, and they get I don't know, like a Physalis, and then you play Shinryu, and you feeling good about yourself. You're gonna like, okay, I'll play Shinryu, I'll board wipe them. They have 3 forwards, so I'm gonna win. You're paying 8 CP in a deck that cares a whole lot more about CP than your opponent, and they only paid a total of 6 CP plus the Gorilla. So you're actually losing 8, 1 card for Shinryu cast, the Shinryu card itself, and then 3 cards plus the Shinryu search. So that's a total of 6 cards you're utilizing, one of which is coming from your deck, and is usually the other copy of Shinryu. Whereas they only pitched 4 cards, and now they're in a situation where they can re-Gorilla, or they could alternatively Ramza. And for that reason, I actually didn't view Shinryu as much of a board wipe as I viewed him as a storm card, basically, because 2 CP search anything from your deck. It's actually a really, really CP efficient storm card. The only reason why I even had him at 2 was because I needed to be able to threaten him in a top cut scenario, or even in Swiss, because most people are going to expect the Shinryu to be present. If my opponent knows I'm not on Shinryu, there's no reason for them not to turn 1, play Corella, and then similarly on turn 1, just play Renoa and try and get like 7 forwards on the field. But the existence of Shinryu is important. But his actual tidal wave ability in an early game against especially Knights is not as debilitating as I think people think it to be. I might be in the minority in thinking that, but in practice, when I was doing my testing, going a Yuffie route versus going a Shinryu route, while Yuffie is not a 100-0 matchup by any stretch of the imagination, the Shinryu route almost always had me losing. As far as summons are concerned, 3 copies of Asura. The Asura is wildly good at recurring things in this deck, whether it be recurring the Nash, as previously talked about, whether it be recurring the Zidane, the Luso, the small Yuffie. All of these are extremely good targets, as well as the ability to reactivate Yuffie for blocking after Yushi's unblockable, or alternatively for another Yuffie special. Alexander is just an extremely, extremely good summon. You can do fun things like on cast 3, when Rosa triggers, on the stack of the Rosa trigger, cast the Alexander, so that you start your you start on 4 casts with 5 backups up and at minimum 2 cards in hand, which is pretty nice, because usually you draw something you can play, and then you try and get to Luso 7 pretty easily. And then Chocobo at 3, pretty standard. 1 copy of Alexander I think is extremely important, because it's literally the only way to deal with Une, which is something that KP realized when I played KP on day 2. And it needs to be here, and I need some form of dealing with monsters as long as Tori Kelly exists in the world. I do sometimes wish I had another copy of this, but I don't think that it's probably worth upping to 2, because I think that it's very situational. Now, I also included 5 water summons in here, and there's 3 reasons why I did that. 1, I think that they're just very good summons. Obviously, Cuchulainn is extremely good. You can play it off of Philo, Kites, or Fran. And then Poo Poo also, I think, is pretty good. The second reason I put them in is because of the EX burst in their corner. So now we're running a Storm list with 10 EX bursts, whereas a traditional Storm list usually was only on like 4 to 5, between Alexander, Chocobo, and then the Chocomog. Maybe they would reach like 9, but I don't think that they were usually as impactful as Poo Poo Cuchulainn. Especially Poo Poo if you're on 0 cards in hand. That EX just completely broken. But the third reason, and probably the most debilitating reason why I included Poo Poo and Cuchulainn in here, is that because what their existence does is it basically says that drawing a Lulu means that you can Titus now. Because what you can do is you can tap your backups however you want to do. If you're pitch 1 or win card and tap Philo, Norsh, and Nash, and then you could tap the Fran for water and pitch the summon. And that is extraordinarily debilitating to be Titus in mono wind. I didn't get it off too frequently, but I did get it off versus Mike Powell and it was really, really debilitating for him in Swiss on day one. And I think that actually is like a good segue into the discussion of the limit breaks. So the point of the deck, honestly, was to be able to play Leo in mono wind. I don't think that that's really obscure at all. I think anybody can see that. Leo is unbelievably good in mono wind. He is a storm. I think that most people view limit break cards as being 2 CP less than their actual listed card value is, because you're not paying a card from hand to do it. So the way I viewed it as is that I have 3 extra cards that say pay 1 CP and draw a card. That is unbelievably good. The fact that he even sticks around to just block afterwards is just icing on the cake. Even if I didn't get a forward out of this and I just had a 3 CP draw a card from a side deck, I would 100% still be playing this version. He just makes it even better. Now, Titus as an alt win condition in this deck is ludicrous and probably one of the most like demoralizing things that can happen to somebody in mono wind. And I think that everyone knows how broken this card can be. He can shut off Warrior of Light, assuming that like they Zidane'd away my Nash or something. He can bottom deck any whatever troublesome forward like a Sky Serpent. I've done a bunch of times. And then the drawing 2 means that effectively you paid 6 CP to draw 2 cards if you take away the 2 CP from the card cost on Titus. So that in and of itself actually weirdly storms too. It's usually hard to incorporate him into a storm turn, though I have done that before in this deck list. He is really, really debilitating. After that, the limit break becomes a little bit more straightforward and obvious to any win build. 1 copy of Ace. Ace is actually a much better card than I think people give him credit for. The thing that oftentimes can happen in mono wind, at least from personal experiences, you are storming like a lunatic. You have so many cards and you have so many lines, but you cannot get the Luso no matter what you do. You have 5 backups. You have, at this point, Lulu. You have Rosa. You've been Chocoboing Lulu 20 times this turn. You cannot get the Luso. Eventually, a point has to happen where you say, if I continue trying to find Luso, I am going to deck myself out before I can deal 7 damage. And that's why Ace is really good, because he's basically I'm gonna keep saying he's like 2 CP less. He's like 2 CP, or 6 CP rather, and he does a board wipe at that point. And his board wipe's much easier to get off than I think people realized. During Swiss, I had somebody who dropped a Fel Thanos against me when I had 4 backups and like an Atomos and like 3 cards in hand. And I don't exactly remember all the details, but I know that he felt in a pretty good spot, and then I casted like 3 more forwards and then an ace. And he was like, yep, I guess I scoop here. And then he just scooped because honestly there was no way. He had no cards in hand. He had like no backups because Nash kept breaking them. And Ace was here now drawing me an extra card every turn. The Ace is another like must kill target because he represents like a continuous card advantage similar to Zidane, but honestly I don't think that part even matters. I think the only thing that matters is his board wiping ability. Little Leela, she's in here because you need something else to fill the slot. In reality, you could theoretically cast her to try and deal with a Sid Randell, though honestly Sid Randell's not that big of an issue in this list because of Yuffie. I think a lot of people, that was actually one thing that was wildly beneficial for me, not at this tournament per se, but at an LQ I went to the following week, was that I had one guy who saw I was on win and then dropped a Sid Randell, and I was like, okay. And then turn 2, I had 1 backup down, and I just played Yuffie, and he's like, yeah. And then I was just like, I'll just wait till I get a Yuffie special and continue building my board while he can't do anything, because he can't swing over the Yuffie. And then 1 copy of Zach. This was honestly just like kind of a meme slot that I just put a card in because it didn't really make a difference. Zach's my favorite character from the Final Fantasy series. However, I did have one truly exceptional interaction where I was playing against Tori Kelly. He dropped a Tyvis. I played as Zidane, stole a copy of Zandy, casted Zandy, dealing 7k damage to the Tyvis, Every'd up the Zandy, and then casted Zac for my limit break to finish off the 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 Tyvis. I will say that certain changes I would make to my limit break, I would probably cut the one Titus and put either a copy of Surgus or a copy of Mott in, just because you are not going to cast two Tituses. You're going to cast at least one Leo in the game, and you might as well optimize the number of limit break 1 cards that you can have actually in the deck, because you can't really go too much into limit break 2 cards, namely Cloud, obviously, because of the fact that it really screws up your Leos and your Aces and your Tituses. Because you can't Cloud and Leo 3 times. You can't Cloud and Leo and Titus. So by clouding, you say the rest of my limit breaks are just 2 Leos. That's all you're doing. I did have Cloud in a build version, and I was running a copy of Yugiri EX that can search Yuffie as well, but it felt really clunky. Overall, I'm really, really happy with the deck. There are a few flex spots, and I think namely with like Fran and maybe one copy of the Fina, that I would consider switching around. There are a lot of really good win backups. Echidna is a really good card. I used her in the LQ for the following weekend as a way to Asura, to get back a water card to theoretically Titus. In practice, it doesn't really come up very often, and I'm kind of fallen back against the use of Echidna. However, it is another thing you can consider. Like I was talking about earlier, the goddess is really good. But overall, really, really happy with the deck. Really appreciate all my friends that helped me really hone the deck in. I strongly recommend that you guys continue to try to innovate. I don't think that the meta is so unbelievably stagnant that you can't innovate things. So I'm really hoping that we see some more fun things in future events. I want to give a shout out to the team, obviously, who helped me hone the deck. Shout out to Gamers Command. They have a store on TCG Player as well as a store in the Tampa area. If you guys are ever in the area, strongly recommend you guys utilize them. Try and get whatever cards you need. Shout out to my wife who's made the thumbnail for this video. And I hope you guys have a good day.